Welcome to Redacted Opinions, unfiltered, raw, and authentic. The opinions expressed on this show are those of the hosts alone. And now, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to Redacted Opinions, unfiltered and raw. Let's skip the pleasantries and get straight to the uncomfortable truth. We are told that democracy is the ultimate political achievement. It gives power to the people. It guarantees freedom of speech, peaceful transition of power, the right to protest, and the ability to throw the corrupt out of office. But today, we have to ask a dangerous question. Can the very features that make democracy great also make it inherently unstable? Think about the math of modern politics. To win an election, you don't need to convince everyone. You just need to convince enough people to form a coalition. Because of that, the system we rely on to unite us is actively rewarding division, short-term thinking, shameless pandering, and tribal identity politics. Let's be entirely clear, this is not a left versus right debate. This is a structural postmortem on political incentives. And at what point does democratic representation cross the line into total political abandonment of other groups? Are we still a society built on shared civic values, or has democracy degenerated into a brutal zero-sum competition of grievances? Brian is across from me. The mic is hot. No corporate filters, no PR talking points. Let's get into it, buddy. What do you think?
Wow. Listen, can you just repeat that, please? I think, did you say zero-sum game at the end?
Zero-sum game, yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. I think the world we live in, the Western world, the Western democracies are probably the greatest thing that's happened to mankind. But at the same time, they're also the greatest threat to what we've achieved over the last 10,000 years. What I mean is sort of what you said, that somehow our politics has changed from representing the majority to representing the cohort that got you elected. If you think of it for a second, a system whereby everyone has a say in who the leader is a good thing, can only be a good thing. But what happens is, and I think what's happening in the West is that when, I hate to bring everything back to immigration, but it's like anything else. When you dilute something, after a while, it's no longer what it was. If I have some Irish whiskey on the rocks with a little bit of soda or water, that's nice. If I put more water in, it's not the same thing. And if I put a lot of water in, it's no longer Irish whiskey. We have seen in the last 10 years an migration into Western countries like we've never seen before. And immigration, especially us in Canada and North America, we're built on immigration, but we've done it in a very staged and measured way. And we've built a culture along the way. And what's been happening is that we are very tribal. Last 10, 15 years, we just brought people into the country that didn't necessarily meet the cultural blend in where the society was going. And Canada today looks a lot different. And I don't mean in terms of color, but culturally and values than it did just 15 or 20 years ago. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I really don't know. But what it has done to our politics is this. In order to get elected, you've got to represent or pander or sell yourself to your constituents. And because certain groups of immigrants tend to congregate in certain areas, that means that the common good, if you're a federal MP, for example, you can't think about what's good for Canada unless you get elected. And sometimes you have to do things to get elected, which is counter to the needs of the rest of the country. And I've got some examples later on that I'll bring up that we could
talk about the immigration thing. And this country's built on immigration. I think the important thing to remember is that this experiment we call democracy has only been around for a few hundred years. It hasn't been around forever, and it's only been around in a handful of countries. When you look back at immigration, I think we've had a podcast on that already, where we were both children of immigrants. We are strong believers of immigration, but somehow that changed. And I think a lot of the reason for that change is exactly what we're talking about today. They're not importing people. They're not bringing people in to assimilate with what Canada or the US or Britain or whoever Western country is doing it. They don't bring them in anymore to assimilate and be part of that vision. They bring them in. Basically, it's an economic transaction. You come in and I expect a vote from you. Now, this used to happen. It's not new. I know that many Italians during the 60s and 70s were brought in by the immigration policies of then the first Trudeau version, not much better than the second, but was bringing in those immigrants. And those Italians were forever grateful about, but They were willing to sacrifice what they came with and take on a new life and build this country. That's not happening anymore. The politicians are bringing them in, and basically the agreement is you come in, we expect your vote. That's it. We don't expect you to put your 2 cents into building this country. We don't expect you to sacrifice for this country. In fact, we're going to give you everything to make you successful, to stick around long enough to vote at the next fourth election cycle. It's ridiculous.
Well, I think my whole premise of my argument is what you said, but I'll say it a lot more eloquently than you just said. Basically, democracy is built on representation. And again, that makes it unique with all the forms of government that we've had throughout history and that we have in non-democratic countries today. It's built on representation, but representation can become fragmented. And I think that's what we're talking about. It used to be that we are a country of immigrants, but the immigrants came here to have a better life and to build upon Canadian values. That has changed. We're the first post-national state, according to Justin Trudeau. What does it mean to be Canadian? It doesn't mean different groups organized around different things. So, for example, it could be ideology, ethnicity, religion, class, immigration status, activism, grievance, okay? How does that make Canada a better place? That's the reality, and we haven't encouraged them to leave the old world behind, because if you're leaving the old world, I'm thinking you're leaving it for a better life, because if life was good at the old world, you would have stayed at the old world. So politicians, and the problem we have democratically, politicians got to compete for these groups and these constituents. And the public policy becomes transactional, as you said. Leaders prioritize loyalty blocks. Great example is Presidente Trump in the States. He has loyal support from his core base, the MAGA base, that do not represent a majority of Americans. The country is so fragmented that he plays just to that group at the expense of everything else in the U.S. This is the problem with what's happening. National or civic cohesion weakens when you bring in people without bringing in to build a country. And some communities feel abandoned, and we see that now very much so in Western Europe. We see it in Canada. We see it in Toronto, that all communities, all ethnic groups, all minorities are not treated alike. We have a mayor in Toronto that's very transactional and very open about it. I'd say most politicians are smart enough to be transactional, but then to be coy about it. But we've got a mayor in Toronto that has no problem to go to every single parade in the city, be it gay pride, raise a Palestinian flag, be it whatever, but God forbid she'll show any support whatsoever to the Jewish community in the city. And I'm not even talking about Israel, I'm talking about the Jewish community in the city. So that's the problem we have when you have immigration, which is transactional and not to build the country to make us a melting pot.
I think there's two underlying dynamics at play that are killing us, to be honest. First of all, our leaders are not the leaders of yesterday. These people will sell out their soul for a dime. They lack principle, they lack integrity, they have very little character. And like I said, they will flip the switch, depend which way the wind goes. That's what they believe in today. And they have no problem saying things that they absolutely have zero belief in just to get the pandering, the votes. I think one problem, the leaders just aren't there. But the more important or underlying problem, I think, speaks directly to the democratic process. Democracy, by its nature, is the majority rule, which means 50+1, right? Yeah. But the way it's evolved over time, it hasn't become that anymore. Now it's basically the biggest, smallest group gets to tell everybody else what to do. And if we look at governments like Italy, since the Second World War, Italy was a laughingstock because every party had something to gain by getting those votes. And so they were eternally in this mishmash of, we'll work with you and we'll work with you. And governments fell every week. Literally, we're falling every week. We're going down that same path with two-party system, but within that party, you see all the fragmentation that's starting to happen, which to me, that's the underlying problem with democracy, is that it allows, in the conditions we have today, if one side, the majority side, is fragmented, then the biggest, smallest group will be able to drive their agenda, regardless of what that other 51% want or care about, because they don't have the power.
Listen, I agree. You and I have talked about this a lot in the past, okay? And I agree with the mechanics of what you explained, but where I think you and I disagree is that we have the ability to vote in this country. But when you have voter turnouts for municipal elections of 20%, 15%, that means you just have to get that percentage, that cohort. Like if you look at Olivia Chow, because I really have a bone to pick with the mayor of Toronto. If you look at her, okay, She is not representing the people of Toronto. She represents the 15 or 20 or 25% of the people that vote. And who is that cohort of 15 to 20% of people that vote? A lot of them are people that are on the left. Okay, that's okay. They're on the left. A lot of them are renters. A lot of them are workers. If you get voted in by 20% of your base because the other 80% aren't voting, that's how we get ourselves into this type of situation. So where you and I sort of disagree, I don't believe the system is screwed up. I believe that we, the people, are not exercising our democratic responsibilities and obligations of voting. Listen, you look at Iran right now, okay? You look at the people that want to oppose the regime. That's the majority, but they can't vote. They can't vote in North Korea. They can't vote in a meaningful way in Russia or in China. We can, but we don't. If they had the ability to vote, they would, but they don't.
Okay, but then I will bring back our great federal system at play. Okay, people voted for certain people to represent them on certain issues. And when the government has zero qualms about basically doing backdoor deals to bring people from the opposite side of the spectrum to your side, and all of a sudden you've got a majority, how is that democracy in action?
We allowed this to happen because the prime minister that got elected, and every time we elect a leader in this country, it's not a majority, it's a majority of the minority of the votes. Whose fault is that? Because if people that don't vote, no one is being stopped from voting. They're either voting because they're apathetic, they're either not voting because they're ignorant, they're either voting because they may think, why bother? Nothing's going to change. But the point is, it's not the democracy that is suppressing the vote, it's the people themselves. And I think it's because we've lived a very blessed life in this country, especially over the last 50 years. And we don't know hardship. We don't have any historical memory. And we don't teach history anymore. So people forgot the sacrifice young men and women in Canada and the States and the West fighting wars did for our freedoms and our ability to vote our leaders in and out. I think we've done it to ourselves. I think where you and I disagree, you believe the system is the problem. I believe the people that don't take advantage of the system are the problem. And then that creates a situation where the opportunists, okay, the people that are transactional are able to get in because the rest of us sit back and do nothing.
But I disagree because you look at your favorite city and your favorite mayor has won, with less than 30% of the vote, their point. But she got there. We had two conservative candidates. Yeah. Right. So most people went out and voted. Okay. They got to vote for one or the other. They did their due diligence. They went out and they cast the vote in favor of their beliefs, which, let's say, dumb it down. It's just conservative values against her socialist ideas. Together, they're over 60%, right? But because the system allows every Tom, Dick, and Harry to just jump in there, put their name up there, right? That vote gets split. And now you've got a situation where you can't tell me that all those people don't care. They're busy going to freaking work, paying taxes in this goddamn city and making ends meet.
So really what you're saying is that if we're talking about Toronto, we're saying the left and the far left are smarter than the right. Because they'll just put forward one candidate, but those of us in the center of the right are too stupid. We put forward 20 candidates. There's two things. We've got to get organized, but it's still only a small percentage voting. If we had the majority voting, this wouldn't be problematic. But if you start off, and let's say we're talking center and center right, okay? If you start off with a small percentage of center right that's going to vote, and then you have all these fringe idiots that are running for center right, it's going to happen. But if every one of us voted, or every one of us that could vote voted, it wouldn't have the same impact. This is not a systemic problem. This is an apathy problem.
I think it's a bit of both. I don't think it's as simple as voter apathy. I think the system kills people's willingness to go out there and vote. Third, they don't feel like it's going to make it. You just said it yourself. Why is that? The system creates that.
So what tweaks to the system need to be done?
I told you, I think the biggest problem we have are leaders who aren't leaders anymore.
No, that's not system. Those are
but that's the problem, because the people who get elected continue to facilitate the same bullshit.
I understand there's nothing stopping someone else from running against them. So you keep saying the system. I think we're saying the same thing, but I think that you're blaming it on the system and I'm blaming it on the people, okay, the voters. Because I could tell you what we've got to do to get rid of idiots and get in governments that are representative. People got to go out and vote. That's the tweak that has to happen on my side. What's the tweak that has to happen on your side?
I think if you think that the system is intentionally created to help the guys like you and me. You're kidding yourself, okay?
I'm not saying that.
The system is built to fail, to keep
No.
the people in power in power. That's the whole point. That's the point I'm getting at.
But listen, if you and I had the ability to go to every Canadian, if we could have an edict and say that you have to vote, and if you don't vote, you're going to get a fine or you're going to go to jail. I don't believe that we should do that. But if we did that, and if we got, what's our population? 45 million, 50 million?
I don't know. How many people we let in the door this year?
And if you look
Officially
at
or unofficially?
That's true. You can be unofficial voter. At least some people want to do that. And if everyone that was of legal age had to vote, this wouldn't be a problem. That demonstrates it's not a system problem. It's not. Now, you're right. The people that run are running for the wrong reasons often, okay? The thing is that in Russia, in North Korea, in China, if you wanted to change the system, if you wanted to challenge the power elite, you couldn't do that. You would be shot or jailed. That's a systemic problem. That's a problem with the system. We don't have that problem. We've got a problem of apathy. We've got a problem of people who've just given up. And, if you give up, then you're going to sit back and enjoy the ride.
Well, no, I think the opposite is happening. That's the problem. I think that's my worry right now. You think that people are getting apathetic. I think people are getting angry because they don't have those outlets. They're not being heard. The politicians are playing this bullshit game that we're talking about. We're pandering to those minorities. And at some point, that majority is going to flip. And you're starting to see that in Britain. You're starting to see that in Ireland. You're starting to see that in other parts of Europe where the people who actually pay the goddamn taxes in the country have had enough. And now you're seeing fires set the mosques, fires set the freaking schools. That's not acceptable. But that's what happens when government refuses to acknowledge that what they're doing is not right.
People are angry, okay? And people are going to... Donald Trump was an example of that. You had the Tea Party was a group of angry, extreme right-wing or left-wing or something-wing idiots in the States, okay, that no one took seriously. And then Trump came around and he was able to get the legitimacy. So you're right. The system is reset in the States. I understand and I appreciate that there's anger out there. But the anger is there because no one is going out and voting. No one is going and doing the things they can do. And if they don't do that, then it's going to be the law of the jungle. And we see that happening in the States. And what has the net effect been in the States? To U.S. dominance in the world, to the economies of the world, to Americans' prosperity. It doesn't work. That's not the solution. I agree that's happening. And I agree it's going to continue to happen. But it wouldn't happen if every one of us that could vote voted. And that's not what's happening.
I don't think it's just a voting problem. I think you're being a bit, I don't want to say naive, but certainly very definitive on your view of what the issue is with the country and why these guys continue to get
elected. I'm going to prove that it's a voting problem. But I'm going to prove it and tell me how it's wrong. If everyone that could vote voted, then truly, no matter how they voted, if everyone voted, the government we would have elected would represent the majority of the people if they did it, but they don't. And that's how we get into situations like you talked in Italy, or we're having now in Western Europe, or even in the States.
They don't vote because you said so. They don't believe in the system anymore. So you're sort of the chicken and the egg.
There's no chicken.
He just got and he was a majority winner less than 2 years ago.
There's no
7 prime ministers in freaking 4 years in the UK.
There's no chicken in the egg. I want to have a yacht, but I don't want to work. It's not going to happen. The thing is that we have the ability to make the change. We don't use it. The only way they're going to get freedom and democracy in non-democratic countries is by armed revolt, is by taking over, is by bloodshed. We're going that way. I agree. But we don't have to. That's the difference. And my role is to, as I've taken you under my wing for the last 25 years, I've got to show you the way, the errors of your way, of the way, before I pass on. The months or years I have left is to get you on the right track.
No, I think you're part of the problem. It's people like you that believe wholeheartedly system, and I'm more of the Machiavelli, like, screw this shit. I'm going to do what it takes to get things that I want. That's the more realistic approach in my view.
But that's
people. They don't participate.
But that's what we are right now. What I'm saying is, let's go back to what we're talking about today is democracies. Democracies need to represent the people. And they can only represent the people if the people vote. If the majority of the people don't vote, then they're not representative. the greatest thing about democracy, where you can vote and you've got to get elected to represent the people. If enough people aren't voting, then the democracy isn't going to work. And that's what we see. That's the change that we're seeing right now. It didn't matter. People didn't vote 30, 40 years ago either. I mean, voter turnout in the West, is certainly in this country, has always been low, but it wasn't problematic because we were a homogenous type society. So it really didn't matter, because whether you vote a conservative or liberal, the world didn't come to an end. It is nowadays, because the dilution of our values, it has been so great that we don't know what we are anymore.
Yeah, well, those days too, the leaders were different. Harper, to me, was one of the best prime ministers. If you're left or right, he managed the country, and that's what their job's supposed to do.
But so did Chrétien, and so did Turner. Like the thing is, there was not a big difference between liberal and conservative.
Yes.
My dad was a big liberal organizer. And I was growing up as a kid, he'd be campaigning, and he says, "We got to get the machine working. We got to get our guy in." And the thing, when I was like 16 or 15 or 14, I thought, yeah, we're going to get in. The world's going to come to an end. But what I realized is that my dad's guy didn't get in. And the next day, the world went on. In fact, there was no difference. I went to work. Gas was still available for 30 cents a liter. A Big Mac was still 35 cents a. Nothing changed. But nothing changed because we were all the same. We all believed in the same thing.
Right.
Let's sort of talk you some examples right now.
Well, I'd like to use one of your examples, and maybe you can explain how your theory works. I am fascinated by what's gone on in New York City. What is it, 14, 15, 16 million people, maybe even 20 million people? Okay. Yeah. And this clown gets elected by how many, to your point, maybe 13%, 14% of that population. Now, that of that 20 million people, 17 or 18 million are going to be friggin' pissed off about it. And you can say they didn't vote. Okay. But now he's in power. What does he do? Instead of trying to bring people together, he's fanning the flames. How do you think it's going to end? It's not going to be an election that's going to.
I agree. And you said it yourself. People didn't vote. The genie is out of the bottle. It might be too late. The fact is that if you bring in people, let's say, that are against Canadian values, now I'm not saying that's what's happening necessarily, but if you decide we're going to bring in a lot of people from North Korea here that don't understand democracy and they believe that their system is the best, and they are now the majority, or at least they vote as a strategic bloc and they're in sufficient numbers. Once their guy gets in, we ain't going back. And you're right. It may be too late. It gets to a point where it's too late. But as you said, people didn't vote in New York. And let's look at the characters they elected, okay? You have Claire Valdez won the 2026 Democratic primary congressional seat. I can't pronounce the first name. Chevalier also won. And Brad
Chevalier is French. You're from fucking Quebec.
No, Chevalier. Again, okay, so what is it? Okay,
you said you couldn't pronounce it. I said you're from Quebec, Chevalier. You can't.
So let's look at Valdez, okay? And you ask yourself, New York is the economic capital of the world, certainly the States, okay? So her issue on labor, strong union worker organization background. Not bad. Workers deserve rights, but I got to tell you something. I grew up, in the 60s and 70s. I was born in the late 50s. People didn't have rights. There were strikes there. We didn't have labor laws. We didn't have the protections we have today. Okay. Housing, tenant protection, affordability, and anti-displacement. I owned a couple of units in my lifetime, condos, apartments, and everything. Anti-displacement. So what do you want me to do, a working guy, if people aren't paying rent? Like, this person doesn't live in the real world. Healthcare, progressive healthcare affordability. I agree. There's got to be a progressive healthcare affordability. But who's going to pay for it if you're dismantling, if you're far left, okay, and you're a socialist, and you're dismantling the people that make the money? Who's going to pay for these things? You got Chevalier. She wants an immigration to abolish ICE. Now, I agree changes have to occur to ICE. But immigration and custom enforcement, the ICE has been perverted. But you're saying that we're not going to control who's coming into the country and get rid of illegal aliens? There's nothing wrong with that part. I mean, the things that have happened are wrong. But abolish ICE, that's simplistic. Foreign policy, babies, not bombs. How the hell's that going to work with the Iranian regime or with the Russians or the Chinese? Healthcare, Medicare for all. That's great. How are we going to pay for it? I'm not opposed to Medicare for all. I think it's good. I wish we had it in Canada. I wish we had a system to work. But how do you pay for it? Brad Lander, okay? He's still very left-leaning, but he's a bit more realistic. Madami, how do you pronounce his name?
Manny.
Like these guys were not elected by majority. They were elected because people aren't voting. So let me ask you something. Let's say, for example, in an alternate universe, I believe in what you're saying. And I do believe in a lot of what you're saying, but the system is bad. You still haven't answered. If you were the king of the world, what changes would you make to the system?
It would be a benevolent dictatorship.
You're right. That is, I remember in my poli-sci days, that is the best form of government, a benevolent dictatorship, a Queen Elizabeth type thing. I agree, but it don't exist. So how would you change the system? You talk about revolution. I understand that. But now once the revolution is over and, we've got the new dictator in and he goes crazy, what changes would you make to the system?
I think mandating voting would probably be at least have some people would have to at least think about what they're when they vote.
I
And to vote, you need to have skin in the game, not some freaking asshole who just got off a plane. You got to own a business, have citizenship, own property. You need skin in the game to have a say in what goes on in this country.
Well, you know what then? You and I agree 100%, because if that's the change, okay, it's not throwing away the system, it's tweaking the system, okay? And I agree. You do have to have skin in the game. There used to be a time in this country, and correct me if I'm wrong, not too long ago, in order to vote in a municipal election, you have to be a property owner. You have to be a taxpayer. And I don't think that's anything wrong, because they're the people that pay the taxes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay? They're the people that have a skin in the game. But when you have a situation where you got the taxpayers aren't voting, and you get all the people, the consumers of social welfare, and it's not fair to say all the people, but you got a lot of people that are consumers and saying, we want the libraries open 7 days a week. We want more food banks. We want all the, nothing wrong with that stuff, but they're not paying for it.
And you've also got a government that is continually ghosting their fucking citizens. Okay. They're not truthful with us. It's what your federal government does to Canadians every day. With the CBC talking about how great things are, or Olivia Chow talking about how crime has never been better in Toronto because she's got it under such control. Meanwhile, they know damn well that that's not true. All right, but so that's what they're telling the public.
So I think you and I are closer than we're coming across. I don't find fault in anything you said. The only thing I have fault is that the system is not corrupt. It needs to be tweaked. Nothing is perfect. Everything gets tweaked. My car gets tuned up every year, because if I don't tune it up, it's going to be working less efficiently. So we're not saying kill me, throw my car away. What we're saying is you got to tweak. So I think we're agreeing the system needs to be tweaked. But to say the system is broken, it's not efficient. It's not running on all cylinders. Let's fix the cylinders. I don't have a problem with things you said.
So I'm just going right to the end point here because we're running low on time. But okay. I find it interesting that here we are in the final point, and it basically says exactly what we've been talking about. All right. Democracy, we agree, despite all the shit that we have to deal with, is still probably the best system out there, the closest to the best that we can get today, given the systems that are out there. How do we fix it? To your point, you threw it on me, I'm throwing it back to you. Well, how do we fix this system that you believe in can be salvaged?
Well, I think the number one thing we do is we got to get people out to vote. And there's a couple ways we can do it. We can do it by educating and encouraging, or even maybe being a bit draconian, is mandating. You have to vote. If you're of voting age, people say, well, hold it. That's very right. That's very fascist. You have to vote. Well, you have to complete your census.
Yep.
You have to stop at a stop sign. Okay. You can't speed. So I don't know that that's necessarily a draconian thing. We have a democracy that's precious, and you have to vote, just like we did years ago when I was a kid, before all this anti-vaccine stuff. If you're going to go out, your kids going to school, you needed vaccinations for measles and for mumps and for polio and all that type of stuff. Governments do that. That's the number one thing we have to do, I think, to change the system. And then the number two thing we have to do, more so the Americans than us, but limit campaign financing, and limit it so that you can't give $10 million. It's limited to $1,000 or $10,000 so that my vote is as strong as, or my needs are as strong as a big corporation. Those are the two things I think that would make a big difference.
How about just making corporate donations completely illegal?
I agree.
All the fundraising per person.
I think you're right, because the government represents the people, not the corporation. I think those two things alone, but then where do we start?
Well, I think you've missed one point in your outline that I think is very important. Those voters that are so important to your success of the system, they're also a problem, because voters today aren't voting for the country. Voters today are voting for what's in it for me. And that's the huge problem that contributes to what's going on. Because if everyone actually gave a shit about Canada, then Canada would be the priority, would force those piece of garbage leaders to cater to what Canada needs, not what their own self-interests are and what the voter groups that they pander to. So I think that's the other piece that's missing from your argument, is that those voters that are so crucial to your system, they need to change. And I don't know how you're going to do that, because the ones we're bringing in right now, they don't care about Canada.
So I think we've come full circle. I think what we start off by saying democracy is the best system in 10,000 years we've ever seen. And it's also the worst or most fragile. And I think that's how we're ending off the podcast.
Yeah.
I think that we have something really good. Okay. It's ours to lose, and we're losing it. Because there's no other system out there that I'm aware of that's better. We have fascism, we have socialism, we have communism, we have democracy, you got capitalism, we got all these isms, okay? There's not one that's better. And what we're doing is...
Forgot one.
What's that?
You forgot the one.
What?
The benevolent dictatorship, which yours truly, would be happy to run.
Well, and you know what? I would... Well, you're a bit scary. You're a bit off there. But I would probably vote for you. But, it brings up an interesting point, because you're right. Again, I remember learning that the best system is a benevolent dictator, but power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. How long would he remain benevolent? And we find ourselves in the same situation. So I think so far democracy is the best one. Is it perfect? No. Is it flawed? Certainly. But we have the means to fix it. But you're right. We have voters that are ill-informed. Voters not thinking about the country. They're thinking about their own issues, okay, and not the greater good. And I don't know how we fix that. You certainly don't fix it when you dilute the values of a country that we've done in the last 20 to 30 years.
And I'm going to finish it off with a closing comment. Democracy, to your point, gives people a voice. But if every group, as we've stated a number of times in this, only demands power for itself, and every politician only serves the groups needed to win, democracy will stop being a shared project and becomes a competition of grievances of us versus them. And that's what we're seeing all over the place right now. I don't know how we fix it, but anybody listening, I would hope that they would think, to your point, step up, educate yourself, get involved, because the alternatives aren't much better. The alternatives are scary.
300% on that. Can I take a second to talk about we got a special guest going to join us next week. We're going to talk about not so much PTSD, but the stresses on being an emergency first responder. And we got a real special guest star. Jeff McGuire is a former Deputy Chief of Police with Toronto Police Service. He was the Chief of Police with the Niagara Regional Police Service. And most recently, he was the Executive Director of the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police. He's got a 40-year police record experience, working all sorts of units from homicide to frontline policing. So I think if anyone knows what it's like, Jeff does. I think it's going to be a great episode.
I'm looking forward to it, because I think I suffer from some PTSD having to deal with you over all these years. So I'm looking forward to maybe some therapy.
All I could say, buddy, my hair used to be dark, and two things have killed me: marriage and friendship to you. But life goes on.
On that note, folks, life does go on. We'll see you next week. Till then, take care and get out and vote.
Take care, everyone, and get out and vote.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Redacted Opinions. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed our podcast to help build our audience. Tune in next week for another episode of Redacted Opinions.